There's something that's really been sitting with me lately, and it's this idea that the culture war in the United States is not the main event. It's not the main thing that is actually at root of all of the issues that is going on. It's the distraction. And that might sound like a bold claim, especially when we're living through headline after headline about, book censorship and anti-trans legislation and attacks on critical race theory. But if you zoom out, what becomes obvious to me is that these so-called moral panics are in fact very serious, but that they are manufactured and engineered distractions. Well, more than that, they are inherent divisions trying to pit people against each other, and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're dividing us. They're getting us to fight over symbols and identities and buzzwords, while the people actually hoarding the power and the wealth continue to do so unchecked. Because while we're arguing over whether certain people should use certain bathrooms or whether a teacher should be allowed to assign Toni Morrison, billionaires are buying politicians and corporations are writing legislation. And don't get me wrong, those are important issues to tackle, obviously. But in that same vein, my point here is what I'm trying to bring to the discussion is the fact that we're already being distracted from the most fundamental reality of our society, that we're in the middle of a class war. But because the people in power know that class solidarity would be their downfall, they pit us against each other in every other way possible. And they do this through the Christian conservative indoctrination that I was raised in. They do this by making sure that white evangelical Christians consider everyone else their enemy. That is who has been doing the bidding of those in power all along, evangelical churches. Now, before you get defensive, I'll say what I always say. I'm not here to dehumanize and villainize the everyday believers. I'm here to expose the institution, the belief system itself, the ideology. Because those churches, the ones I grew up in, they were ground zero for this kind of distraction. Again, I was taught that liberals hated America. I was told that gay people were trying to destroy the family. I was told that climate change was a hoax and that public school teachers were brainwashing kids to become communists. I was told to be a self-proclaimed Zionist and to support the statehood of Israel, no matter the genocidal cost. I remember hearing from the pulpit multiple times that voting in a liberal way was the same thing as voting for the devil. And what I think is important to understand is that just because, according to the law, religious leaders from a pulpit, pastors from a church pulpit, can't openly endorse specific political figures running for office or specific political parties, doesn't mean they can't talk about the actual policies, the actual conversations, okay? And the thing is, I didn't hear this in some backwards shack. This isn't a fringe belief. I heard it in the wealthy, polished mega church with Broadway level productions of praise and worship services and like $1 million sound system or something like that. Like, there was money involved, okay? The emotional manipulation was covered in, bass drums and fog machines and praise music, and it was glossy. It was well funded. It was essentially a propaganda engine that presented itself as wholesome family values. And for the kids growing up inside it, like myself, it was all we knew. But even as a kid, I thought I had a choice. They told me I could choose Jesus. They said I had free will, that it wasn't about good works. It wasn't about how you acted. It was about your faith. And when you're a child and all of your friends, your teachers, your parents, and every adult you trust tells you that questioning God or not having faith in God will send you to hell, that's not really a choice. That is coercion. That is manipulation. They didn't teach me how to think. They taught me what to think. And they wrapped it up in the language of freedom. And that is the genius of authoritarian systems at heart. They don't always use force. Sometimes they use comfort. Sometimes they use belonging. You get community and safety and certainty so long as you never challenge the rules or challenge the belief system. Because if you do, you're not just wrong. You're not just participating in a free marketplace of ideas. You're considered dangerous. You're, more importantly, considered sinful. You'd be a threat to the fabric of the religious community. And that's how they maintain control. Not with, like very blunt violence, not with chains, but with shame. And here's the thing. It worked for me. It works because you can't manipulate people unless you give them something to feel or to root for. You can't manufacture allegiance without that emotional tie. But in order to make the distraction of the culture war work, in order to consider gay people and other ethnicities and other religions, before you can consider them your enemy, you need a powerful emotional hook, which is where childhood indoctrination comes into play. I'm going to walk you through, for those of you who weren't raised in this environment, what it was like being raised as a Christian conservative at a megachurch in a predominantly evangelical Christian city. Because you don't wake up one day like just believing in Armageddon and rejecting evolution and science, okay? You're primed. You are trained to think this way. You are immersed. I'm an atheist now, and I've been watching a lot of atheist content, and one thing that a lot of atheists will say is like, everyone is born an atheist. We are taught religion, right? And this is very indicative of that, all right? Because from purity pledges at youth group to being taught rapture theology in Sunday school, the fear of the world, of reality, is constant. And that is how the immersion works. There's always this sense that the end of the world could happen at any moment. I truly believed that. And that if you weren't right with God, such as, obeying your elders or rejecting anything liberal, you were going to be left behind. And I'm not kidding when I say that I and many other people had recurring nightmares about the rapture. I remember checking like the closets with, or, checking like my house if nobody else was home, or maybe I took a nap and I woke up and they were out running errands, but I didn't know that, and calling my parents just to make sure I hadn't missed the capital C call. It was crazy. And then there was, of course, youth group, which was the bait, right? Like free pizza, video games, Christian rock concerts, even breakdancing shows, like all for Jesus. I'm talking, again, full production value with the lights and the bass drums and the dropping the beat. It was honestly like kind of exhilarating. It was emotional. There was a tie to it. And then the middle of all of that really high intensity performance, they would hit you with sermons about how sex before marriage or sex outside of a heteronormative marriage would ruin your life, and how certain ways to view politics were the only godly choice. Every moment of my upbringing was engineered to be emotionally memorable and therefore manipulative so that the messaging would stick deeper. Christian schooling, like for myself, because I didn't just go to the school, or I didn't just go to the church on Sundays, I also went to the Bible-based Evangelical Christian high school affiliated with that megachurch. And Christian schooling at this form of education added another layer of insulation. We were taught that climate change or environmentalism was basically pagan worship at best, or a complete fabricated host at worst. We were told that Zionism was non-negotiable, that the theory of evolution was literally satanic. We weren't allowed to question scientifically. We weren't allowed to question our pastors or our textbooks. Every lesson came with a prepackaged worldview, and that worldview was always centered around things like American exceptionalism, because it was a Christian nation, Christian supremacy, and also, of course, patriarchal control. You weren't just learning math or science, you were learning submission, is really my point here. You were learning to distrust the outside world, to distrust secularism or the liberal Hollywood elites. You were learning that the truth could only come from those who had power in your community. The reality is, there are so many factors that caused my indoctrination as a Christian conservative to be powerful. And again, for people who weren't raised in the evangelical Christian church like I was, it can be hard to understand why today's MAGA supporters are so cult-like. But I have real sympathy for people who are still clinging to the worldview of Christian conservatism, to that environment, because they're hoping that their suffering in this world has some supernatural meaning. That's what they're clinging to. And don't get me wrong, I do think that there's definitely an argument to be made for holding Trump voters accountable for the mess this country is in, okay? For the authoritarianism they voted for. But I think it's a mistake to look at these misguided votes in every case, every single case, as a sign of someone's internal evil. Of course, there are actual bigots who hate people who aren't exactly like them. I'm not talking about them. But again, I was indoctrinated in this environment. I can promise you there are plenty of Christian conservatives who, while still deserving of our criticism, who are still deserving of our frustration at their stupidity for voting for Trump, are more misguided and afraid than specifically out to pick on the little guy. The reality is, it took a lot of work for me to question the belief system I was indoctrinated into. And I'm still trying to navigate how to challenge that belief system, how to get everyday Christian conservatives to question the messages coming out of the pulpit, and how to empower them to change their own minds in this regard. I can guarantee you this, though. I can promise you that the more we feed into the narrative that this is all about Christian conservatives versus everyone else, the more we are playing into the narrative that proves their worldview correct. You're proving them right. The more we are playing into the culture war that the ruling elites want us to fall for. That is what's going on. The thing is, as much as I truly believe that everyone deserves to worship whatever gods they want, I still maintain that I think organized religion as a whole holds societies back from progressive progress and holds individuals back from authentic expression. And that brings me to the bigger picture here. Organized religion functions as a hierarchical control system. It sells itself as a spiritual guide, but what it's really doing is teaching you how to obey. You're taught that morality comes from authority in these environments, that truth is inherited, not internally discovered, that doubt is dangerous, and that the best thing you can do with your life is to submit to God's will. That is exactly what I was taught over and over again, which conveniently always seemed to line up with the pastor's opinions or certain politicians' policies. And if your questioning doesn't match that doctrine or that policy, it's labeled as rebellion. And when you grow up in such a tight-knit community, you don't really know what life will look like on the other side of that. If your lived experience contradicts the interpretation of scripture of that environment, it's framed in such a way to suggest that your experience is wrong. And I just think that's so dangerous. I was told that I had a personal relationship with Jesus, and this is an argument that a lot of Christians will fall back on, that it's not about, the good works that we do, or it's not about the way we vote, it's about having a personal relationship with Jesus. But I still maintain that such a relationship came with a long list of rules and an even longer list of enemies, because it wasn't a relationship. It was institutional loyalty. It was branding. Jesus was the figurehead, but the real power was in the church structure and in the community. And in the top of that structure was wealthy, mostly white men who made decisions for the rest of us and called it divine. And they were celebrities in their own right with, designer suits and book deals and all of the things. Like, their word was gospel, and questioning them was seen as heresy. Not questioning your lived experience, questioning the pulpit.